welcome everybody. Welcome to the first of our series of deep dives on the draft Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Ko Amelia Sharman toko ingoa, Director Sustainability Reporting, and joining me today to present on draft NZ CS3 is Lisa Kelsey, Senior Project Manager, Climate Standards. So the intent of this deep dive is to clearly explain the proposed disclosure requirements so that you can provide us with informed comments and feedback about any areas you consider need further attention by the XRB board. However, before we dive in, we just have a quick poll to start, and I will launch that now. So, which of the following best describes you in terms of your attendance here at the deep dive today? Excellent. So I can see we have a lot of preparers, some consultants, and 6 users. Really happy to see you here, users. We're really keen to get your feedback and your thoughts as well about the disclosures. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. Oh, a few more answers coming in. All right, I think we'll close that one there. Thank you. Okay, I think I can share the results so you can all see those. So we've got mostly preparers, few users, some assurance providers, consultants, a few academics, regulators, and other. So thank you for answering. That's really helpful for us to know who's coming along. So we'll move on to the next slide. So I'll just provide a very quick recap on what makes up the proposed disclosure framework. It's made up of 3 climate standards, which are collectively known as Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards, and each standard is a piece of secondary legislation. We've got draft NZ CS1, which is where all the 4 governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets disclosure requirements are housed, and the mandatory assurance and greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. NZ CS2, which is our first time adoption standard, and both of those are having their own deep dives over the coming weeks. And then we have draft NZ CS3. This is our very important standard as it houses the principles for disclosure and the general requirements. However, a big message is that it's important that the standards are read together as a package. So today's deep dive is focused on NZ CS3. We will address questions that have come in. So we will address questions that come in. Please put your questions in the Q&A function at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen. We will address those at intervals throughout the presentation, so get those questions in early. We're really keen to make this useful for you and answer the questions that you want to know. So the objective of NZ CS3 is to establish the principles and the general requirements to enable the provision of high quality climate related disclosures. At the upfront, there are some really important sections. There's a scope section. The scope section of the standard sets out which entities the standard applies to. NZ CS3 applies to those entities which are required by the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 to prepare climate statements or group climate statements that comply with the climate related disclosure framework. If you are unsure whether or not you are a climate reporting entity, please do get independent legal advice. And if you are still unsure at that point, then please do contact the FMA. Now, also up front, we talk about the application of the standard. So the XRB board can issue climate standards that apply to interim periods, but for the avoidance of any doubt, the XRB board has clarified in paragraph 4 that NZ CS3 does not apply to interim periods. We also note that any entity that elects to or is otherwise directed to prepare climate related disclosures is encouraged to apply all the requirements of Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. So not to cherry pick among a few. If you want to disclose against the standards, please do think about all of them together. Now, that's all from me. I am really excited to now hand over to Lisa, who will take us through the deep dive contents of NZ CS3.
Thanks, Amelia. We will start with the principles contained in NZ CS3. NZ CS3 is based on the overarching principle of fair presentation. Fair presentation requires an entity to disclose information in accordance with the principles in NZ CS3 and the disclosure objectives and requirements in Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Applying the standards is presumed to result in climate-related disclosures that achieve a fair presentation. However, when compliance with the specific requirements is insufficient to show a fair presentation, additional information must be provided. An entity must ensure that relevant information is not obscured by the inclusion of immaterial detail. To underpin its disclosures and to help guide current and future development in climate-related disclosures, the XRB board has developed a set of principles for high-quality reporting of climate-related disclosures. Such principles underpin the principle of fair presentation. The principles in NZ CS3 have been split into those relating to information and those relating to presentation. Some of you may refer to these as qualitative characteristics if you have an accounting background. These principles have been drawn from a variety of sources, from the TCFD fundamental principles to existing accounting sustainability standards and frameworks. I don't think you will find any standards or frameworks that do not have a set of principles within them. We have written the principles in plain English and provided examples specific to climate-related disclosures. I will talk to a few of the principles today. Balance. Climate-related disclosures are balanced when they do not overemphasize positive news or impacts in a manner that could be interpreted as greenwashing. Balanced narrative explanations require that climate-related risks as well as climate-related opportunities are portrayed in a manner that is free from bias. Consistency. Disclosures that are consistent over time will enhance communication with primary users. To allow for inter-period comparisons, climate-related disclosures should be presented using formats, narratives, and metrics that are consistent from reporting period to reporting period. However, we do recognise that due to the developing nature of climate-related disclosures, there will be changes in metrics, narratives, and formats. In these circumstances, any such changes should be explained. And lastly, I'll just talk to you about coherence. So this principle is about presenting information in a way that achieves integration within climate-related disclosures and inter-integration between climate-related disclosures and other disclosures, including information in the financial statements. So Amelia, I don't know if we've got any questions at this point or...
All right, we do have a couple of questions. They're not on the principles, but we'll answer them anyway. So we have a first question which says, the guide for MIS managers, so that's fund managers, includes/applies all the standards NZ CS1, 2 and 3. This is critical for us as we would use the MIS guidance as starting point and refine using NZ CS2 and NZ CS3. So it's a really good question in that, yes, so if you are a climate reporting entity, all the standards apply to you. The guidance documents have been written in a way to help enable entities to understand the requirements in mostly NZ CS1. Now, MIS managers is a little different. So there is a little bit in the guidance for MIS managers relating to NZ CS3 as well. So yes, please do. The guide for MIS managers does cover 1, 2, and 3, but we will have a deep dive session on all the specifics for MIS managers, and that's in a couple of weeks. Hope that answers that question. And then we have another question, which is about assurance, actually. So would assurance of greenhouse gas data by a parent company covering the New Zealand entity be sufficient to meet the requirements? So that is a bit of a question related to the parent company and who is in scope. Lisa, what do you think about that question? Would assurance of greenhouse gas data by a parent company covering the New Zealand entity be sufficient to meet the requirements?
I don't know. We might pass on that one at this point, Amelia. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so the parent company is part of it. But yeah, we would probably advise you to get advice from your independent legal advisor, from your assurance practitioner, but we will take that question away and think about it a little bit more. So thank you very much for answering it. We just wanted to ask, I have a question actually that I think maybe the listeners would be interested in is, we've got a whole lot of those principles, quite a few of them, and is it possible to meet all of the principles at the same time?
Okay, Amelia, yes, good question. So in practice, all the principles may not be fully achieved. And I guess as a practical example, say you change a metric to enhance comparability because it's become a well-used metric in your industry, perhaps. So you're changing a metric to enable comparability, but consistency then kind of goes out the door. So, and also another example, and we do have a paragraph in the standard, paragraph 10 talks about this kind of trade-off between the principles, and it could be within a principle itself, for example, verifiability. And we know that there are, significant kind of judgments involved and a lot of uncertainty in this kind of forward-looking information. So, you might find there's a tension with that principle. And basically the standard says you consider the needs of your primary users when you're making judgments about these kind of, I guess, tensions and what you do in particular circumstances. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And we've actually got a follow-up question. Thank you, Tim, for asking your question, which is there a hierarchy of principles in the standard?
Hierarchy. Well, I guess all I would say to that is the overarching principle is fair presentation. And those other principles that we've identified kind of, I guess, assist with fair presentation. But the other thing to be aware of is that we do clarify in the standard, there may be circumstances where to achieve fair presentation, an entity may have to provide additional information. And this is because, I guess, every entity has its own specific facts and circumstances, and we write standards, I guess, for the majority, but there may be things you need to add if you consider those are material, or it is material information for your primary users. So I would just probably add that, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to point out, Lisa. So an example of that could be, say, in the governance disclosures. So the draft standard doesn't require an entity to disclose the other activities that members of its governance body are involved in, for example, but however, if an important member of an entity's governance body, say the chair, for example, was also involved in a highly climate exposed activity. So for example, maybe they're also, they have an ownership stake in a coal mine or something, that might be information that would be considered highly relevant for a primary user because they think it might influence that entity's decision making. So in that example, that might be something that the entity would then think, well, it's not specifically required by the disclosure requirements, but it would be information given the principle of fair presentation that an entity would think about disclosing. All right, so thank you. I can see we've got more questions coming in, and they're mostly on the actual disclosure requirements. So we'll go on to the disclosure requirements and then we'll come back to all of these questions. Thank you very much for sending them all in. And Tim's just followed up with, should relevance be a principle? Tim, relevance, yeah, we did think about all of those. So if you look in the standard, relevance is incorporated. Do you want to follow up on that, Lisa?
Relevance is definitely the first principle there. So absolutely, yes, it is a principle, very important principle.
Right. Okay, so yes, if we could just go back, you can see relevance top left under the first information principle. Okay, so let's go on to the general requirements. Back over to you, Lisa.
Okay, so as we've said, CS3 contains principles and general requirements. I'm going to work through each of the 9 general requirements in draft NZ CS3. I will go reasonably quickly and we'll take questions at the end. Maybe some of the questions might be answered as we flow through this, hopefully. So location of disclosures is the first set of general requirements. And I'm just going to mention that section 461 ZJ of the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 requires those climate reporting entities that are required to produce an annual report to include a couple of things. One, a statement that the entity is a climate reporting entity, and two, a copy of the climate statements or group climate statements prepared by the entity, or the address or link to the internet site where a copy of those statements can be accessed. However, the Act does not specify the format of the climate statements or group climate statements. So the XRB board has designed the location of disclosure requirements to provide flexibility to entities to present their climate-related disclosures in a way that is most meaningful for their primary users and to allow evolution over time. NZ CS3 permits entities to provide their climate-related disclosures in a standalone document or within another document, such as an annual report or sustainability report. It is important to note, though, that if the climate-related disclosures are provided within another document, an entity must include a table within that other document clearly identifying the location of the disclosures required by the standard. So it's like an index table. NZ CS3 permits cross-referencing to other locations such as an entity's website. However, there are some boundaries or requirements around the use of cross-referencing. Importantly, if cross-referencing is used, entities must think about the principle of fair presentation we just talked about, and disclosures included by cross-reference should not make the entity's climate-related disclosures less understandable, complete, or coherent. Another point I'd just like to mention is that it also requires the governance body that authorises the climate-related disclosures to take the same responsibility for any of that information that is included by cross-referencing as the same as if they included it directly. Next, we are going to talk about the reporting entity. Except if required elsewhere by legislation, an entity prepares its climate-related disclosures for the same reporting entity as the financial statements. So if the reporting entity is a consolidated group, including a parent and subsidiaries, then the climate-related disclosures are reported in respect of that group. But also we would note that a subsidiary may separately meet the definition of a climate reporting entity in the legislation and have to prepare its own climate-related disclosures. So that will be something that you would have to check. Next, we are going to talk about value chain. We received a lot of feedback that entities must think about themselves in the context of the value chain rather than isolated or standalone. We're clear in NZ CS3 that when an entity is considering its exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities, an entity considers the exposure of its value chain as well. And we also clarify that investments an entity has in other entities, for example, associates and joint ventures, are also considered to be part of an entity's value chain. We do have deep dives that will cover NZCS1, but I just wanted to point out that the risk management disclosures or section in draft NZCS1, paragraph 18C, currently is proposing a disclosure by entities of whether any parts of their value chain are excluded from their processes of identifying, assessing and managing climate-related risks. Next slide. A couple of requirements around reporting currency and reporting period. So it just specifies that if you use currency as a unit of measure in your climate-related disclosures, an entity must use the same presentation currency as its financial statements. And then reporting period, an entity prepares its climate-related disclosures for the same reporting period as its annual financial statements. We've once again specified annual for the avoidance of doubt there. There are also in paragraphs 25 and 26 some requirements around if an entity changes its reporting period and what to do with events after the reporting period and before the date of climate-related disclosures are authorised for issue. These requirements are based on financial reporting requirements, and there's probably no surprises really around those. Next slide. Materiality. We appreciate all the feedback we received on the topic of materiality. Based on the majority of this feedback, we are continuing to align internationally with our materiality definition and using enterprise value as a key consideration. And the basis for conclusions, the XRB board explains that it does not consider the labels such as single or double materiality particularly helpful as they overly simplify this topic. Based on the feedback, the XRB board recognised that it needed to be clearer about the importance of an entity thinking about its impacts on the climate, if those impacts could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's enterprise value. And that entity should take a broad view when thinking about these feedback loops. We have updated the materiality section and we encourage you all to read that very carefully. I just had a few key messages I would like to also make about the materiality section. When making materiality judgments, you think about your own primary users. There is not a uniform quantitative threshold to predetermine what could be material in a particular situation, because it is important that sometimes you could have a very small number, it could even be zero, but that material is still, that information is still material to your primary users. Materiality is pervasive across all our standards. So when applying the requirements to your particular entity, you determine it is not, the resulting information is not material, then you do not need to disclose it. Entities need to assess whether information individually or in combination with other information is material, and materiality judgments are made at each reporting date. So you will have to, at each reporting date, renew your judgments. And I think I should just mention too that just like with financial reporting, record keeping in this area is important. So document those materiality judgments. Next slide, please. Okay, so comparative information, consistency of reporting and restatement of comparatives. We, based on TCFD recommendations, are proposing to require 2 years worth of comparative information for each metric, and we are requiring an analysis of the main trends. There are first-time adoption provisions for both of these proposed requirements. So if you take advantage of these, year 1, no comparatives, year 2, 1 year worth of comparatives, year 3, you'll have your 2 years. And the trend, the analysis of trend, you're given 2 years relief from that. Year 3, you'll have your, you will need to do that. Presenting climate-related disclosures consistently from one period to the next allows for those inter-period comparisons and provides the information about trends. If an entity changes what it discloses, or how it presents its information, it must provide an explanation for those changes and the effect on the current reporting period's climate-related disclosures. If a metric or target is replaced or the methodology used is changed, the explanation provided must include why the replacement metric or target or the new methodology provides more useful information. So I guess we're aiming for consistency, but we know that these are new and there will be changes, and that's recognised in the requirements. Restatement of comparatives is only required for the correction of material errors. NZ CS3 permits but does not require the restatement of comparatives for other reasons. For example, if you define a GHG intensity metric to maybe now include scope 3, where it previously just included 1 and 2. You would not have to go back and restate your 2 years comparators. However, you may have the information and may decide that it's most decision useful for your user to do that restatement. And of course, you are allowed to do that. Next slide. Okay, methodologies, assumptions, and estimation uncertainty. We all recognise that the use of estimates is an essential part of preparing climate-related disclosures, and it does not undermine the usefulness of the information if the estimates are accurately described and explained. So disclosures about methodologies, significant assumptions, and significant estimation uncertainty are essential to ensure primary users are provided with information to understand the amounts in the climate-related disclosures. These cover requirements relating to all the relevant disclosures in the standards, as well as specific requirements relating to scenario analysis and GHG emissions. So paragraph 50 of the draft NZ CS3 requires the disclosure of methodologies and assumptions underlying climate-related scenarios used. For example, the source of data used to construct each scenario, and the scenario process employed. For example, which external parties or stakeholders were involved. These proposed disclosures were drawn from the TCFD guidance, and there's some New Zealand specific requirements added. The XRB board is of the view that these disclosures are very important to avoid the situation where scenarios are a black box to primary users. Paragraphs 51 to 53 require the disclosure of GHG emission methodologies, assumptions, and uncertainty, and these will be part of the assurance engagement. See paragraph 25C of NZCS1. And once again, just like financial reporting, record keeping in this area is very important. You know, the regulator may be looking for some of this information. Next slide, statement of compliance. So an entity whose climate-related disclosures comply with Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards must include an explicit and unreserved statement of compliance. All requirements must be complied with for an entity to state compliance with Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. And this statement of compliance must be presented prominently within an entity's climate-related disclosures. We are getting to the end, just very quickly. So there are 2 appendixes in the standard. Appendix A lists out the defined terms, and you know they are a defined term because they are in italic in the standard. And Appendix B sets out the effective date. The proposed effective date is for annual reporting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. So if you're a March balance date, your first set will be 31st March 24. And if you're June, your first set of climate-related disclosures will be 30th of June 2024. And finally, I actually mentioned this earlier, but each standard is accompanied by a basis for conclusions. Those of you familiar with accounting and auditing standards will be aware of these. The basis of conclusions is intended to provide useful explanations of the XRB board's decision-making process during the standards development. And we encourage you to read these.
All right, questions on the general requirements. We've got lots, Lisa. So we will start. So going right back, if a reporting entity is involved in a joint venture and does not regard that that is material for disclosure, must it state the joint venture and explain why it is not material to report, or can it simply not reference the joint venture?
There's no requirement to state that it's not material or the materiality assessment, no, so they don't need to do that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So for some of you who may know, in the legislation stage, there was a comply or explain part of the disclosure of the bill that was removed at the parliamentary stage. So there is no comply or explain disclosure requirements in any of Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Okay. Does estimation uncertainty include estimates that are not possible to make just yet? As in, you disclose the areas of your emissions, for example, where you are not able to estimate at this point in time. So if I've understood that correctly, then I would say, yes, you would absolutely say, these are estimates. We think that these are, this is the information that we have, and we are, providing this, and this is the level of estimation we have. The level of estimation is that we think that there are emissions here, but we can't get any more specific. We really are encouraging entities to get started on measuring your emissions. If you haven't got started on measuring your emissions, please, do get started, because as Lisa said, the standard is coming in from 2023 onwards, and we really do hope that you will have those levels of emissions. But I would also point out that we are proposing, as part of NZ CS2, that 1 year exemption for disclosing your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. What is the level of detail that the methodology for financed emissions must have, noting that this can be extensive if granular level is required?
Ooh, that's also a very good question. We are going to have separate, I'm not going to just punt it, but we are going to have separate sessions on CS1 where we can get into a lot more detail around kind of the GHG emissions. So maybe we take this as kind of a question to think about, but you do have to, I guess there are general requirements in CS3 where it talks about kind of aggregating information. And it's kind of a case by case, I guess, in a lot of this as to how you aggregate information in a way that you are providing enough to a user without overwhelming them with too much information. I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, it's really, there's a lot in those principles at the front of NZ CS3 that helps to explain, how much information is needed for your primary user. So I think a key message, again, we'd get across is all of this is designed to be useful to that entity's primary user. So we would really encourage you to get to know who your primary users are, who are your investors, and what are they looking for from disclosures from you. Okay.
Well, actually, and another point too, sorry, just thinking about that question, it always takes me a bit longer. Tick, 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 tick. We have allowed cross-referencing. So there is that, you might want to put some and then cross-refer where you feel that extra kind of detail is needed. So there is the ability to do that as well.
It's a really good point, because yes, we're very aware that you might have a variety of primary users. You might have some primary users who really do want a lot more information. And in that case, yeah, as Lisa said, you can use your cross-referencing to provide information on websites or wherever it might be. And then, is the date for publishing disclosures, if in a separate document, the same as the date for publishing financial statements?
So I believe the Act is 4 months after year end, but there is also a requirement to provide a link in your annual report. So you may need to think about that in terms of timing, because I believe that could be 3 months after year end. So yes, I think it's a little bit not a straightforward answer for that one.
Yeah. So if you've got to think about what is your requirement date for, if you are a climate reporting entity that does have to produce an annual report, and the fact that the legislation covering this disclosure regime requires you to put a link in your annual report, and it requires 4 months. But if, as Lisa was saying, if it's earlier, if you have to provide your annual report closer than 4 months, and then, that link in your annual report requirement would mean then that you would have to present it at the same time. But you need to understand, your particular requirements around your publishing of your annual report, if you are a climate reporting entity that needs to do that. Okay, we've got loads of questions. If we do not get to your question today, we will endeavour to answer all of these and put them on the website as well. So, is materiality both ways, i.e. both the entity's impacts on the climate and the climate's impact on the entity? So as Lisa said, please do look in detail at that materiality section. We are very clear in that section that if an entity has impacts on the climate that will come back and affect that entity's value, those impacts are material, and we encourage entities to think broadly about the scope of those feedback loops. So, we're very clear that, a value, the primary user's expectations of enterprise value can be informed by lots of things rather than just monetary value. So in that sense, it's, we don't want to use the XRB board and the XRB, the staff here, we're quite clear that we think that those labels, single, double materiality, are not very useful, but we really do want you to, look at that materiality section in detail. So hopefully that answers that question. Oh, Lisa, go for it.
I was just going to say too that when you look at the actual requirements in the standard, a lot of them are around actually impacts on, you've got your GHG emissions, you've got aspects of your transition plans, you've got targets. So it's the, there's a lot of information that's already required. I just thought I'd add that.
Okay, we've got a question. Is there any reason materiality is defined only across risk and opportunities and not as a general principle across all the climate-related disclosure requirements? So the answer is it absolutely is a general principle across all the climate-related disclosure requirements. So if you can, that's a really helpful question for us. If you consider that it only looks like it applies across the risks and opportunities, that is definitely not what we intend. So really useful feedback for us, thank you. And we will go away and have a look at how we've written that, because it does cover it all.
Yeah, we tried to do that by the as required by the standards to say it does definitely apply across everything, but thank you for that feedback.
Yeah. Okay, general question. Do you expect that reports will cover data as at the period end, or should it cover the period, e.g. reflect how greenhouse gases or governance processes have changed throughout the period? So I guess it's a question of, are you disclosing what the situation is at year end, or are you disclosing what your situation is throughout your reporting period? Great question.
It's at year end, so it's at year end. But thinking a bit more about that, I guess if processes have changed from one year end to the next year end, then definitely you'd want to disclose that as part of your disclosures.
Absolutely. Okay. Is the XRB going to express a view on how and to what extent parent level frameworks and policies will be accepted to meet the requirements of the standards? For example, a small New Zealand exposure would be managed in the context of global risk appetite rather than a risk appetite unique to the New Zealand operations. So I think that's a good question, and then it basically talks about how should New Zealand entities that are a New Zealand entity but in the part of a global operations, how should they think about the standards?
Are you asking me that question?
Have a go, Lisa.
It is the New Zealand entity that is a climate reporting entity that is captured by the legislation, so the requirement is on them. I don't know what else to really kind of say.
So I think again it comes back to that materiality. So how influential, for example, are those risk appetites in terms of the operations of the New Zealand entity? Are those policies that are at a global level, are they, do they really affect your operations in a New Zealand level? In which case, yes, you would absolutely be thinking about the decisions that are made in New Zealand for the New Zealand entity. But I think this is a really good question in the context of this is a new standard, and we are all very much looking forward to seeing how entities will take up the requirements. It's really useful, these questions, because we can provide more guidance over time. But as Lisa says, the entity that is reporting is the New Zealand entity. So it's all about the operations and the activities of the New Zealand entity. And if international standards, etc., or policies are affecting that New Zealand entity, then we would expect that they would be part of the disclosures. Okay. Oh, this is a good one. Is it not problematic that detailed disclosure requirements are being promulgated when there is not yet an agreed taxonomy nor carbon measurement method in New Zealand nor globally? So I would say, well, there definitely is emissions. There's very standard greenhouse gas emissions measurement techniques and standards. So as we will talk about in the other deep dives, we refer to the greenhouse gas. You can use the greenhouse gas protocol or ISO. So yes, there's definitely those. In terms of a taxonomy, absolutely, take the point that there's something that is in development. However, we have spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about the New Zealand disclosure requirements in the context of international disclosures and what is happening. So if you haven't seen them, on the consultation page of the website, we have very detailed documents which compare every single disclosure requirement in the NZCS1 compared to the TCFD recommendations and guidance, and then another document that compares them to the international sustainability standards. And I hope that a message you get when you read those is that we have tried very hard to be internationally aligned. They're very internationally consistent, and we've put very clear, we hope, answers if we haven't, if we've moved away and why we suggest moving away. So, there's a lot. It's a very fast-moving space, lots going on. So we do expect that there will be more developments in terms of taxonomies, etc. Over time, and the XRB is paying extremely close attention to that. Okay. We've answered half of this question, so we'll just answer, I guess, the first one. Do the standards require integration of climate risks into published financials?
So there are some requirements in the which we'll talk more about in the strategy section of NZCS1 around current financial impacts, and definitely there could be relationships. Well, there is relationships back to the financial statement of financial performance and financial position. So come along to our deep dive on NZCS1 and we'll go into that in a bit more detail.
Okay, next question. In terms of being able to do the disclosures in a standalone document, would it be possible to do it in 2 documents, for example, or have some in the annual statements and some in a standalone document?
I guess you just have to go back to the principles, the principles in the standard about, yes, there is flexibility there, but you do need to think about a user reading these. And yes, you do have the ability to do that, but think about coherence and think about the best way to present that information. So we are definitely allowing the flexibility, but you do need to step back and kind of go, is a user going to be able to actually access that information and get the information they need easily?
Absolutely. Okay. The need to use the climate reporting entity's annual financial reporting period for disclosure of emissions is at odds with the Australian emissions reporting requirement. That's the NGERS Act 2007, which requires everyone disclosing emissions to use 30 June as the year end date. How would you suggest dealing with this misalignment? So we are definitely aware of this. We are definitely also aware that for some climate reporting entities, it will be different to your, if you have emissions requirements under the NZ However, the legislation specifies that the climate reporting must be the same as the financial reporting period. So it is out of the XRB's control. It is designed so that the primary user can look at the climate information and the financial information together to have a more holistic understanding of the position of the entity. So yes, unfortunately, if you are required to report in Australia at a different period, you will have to do emissions calculations to different emissions periods. That is something we are aware of, and unfortunately that is just how it is going to be, because we have no control over that. Okay, another question. We currently report for the same annual reporting period, but we report our emissions in our half-year report as audit is not complete until then. Will that still be possible? Or do we need to have our emissions audited at the same time as our financial statements and report in the annual report?
I'm going to go with the assurance. So the current assurance required over climate-related disclosures is just over the GHG emissions, and it is annually at year end.
Yeah, and so importantly, the legislation does require the climate statements, to be either in your annual report or a link in your annual report. So yes, it does have to be linked to your annual report if you have annual reporting requirements. I hope that answered that question. Okay. If a subsidiary is required to produce climate standards, I'm assuming that means climate statements, does the parent also have to disclose, or can the parent just reference the subsidiary climate statements? So as Lisa answered before, if a parent is a climate reporting entity and a subsidiary is a separate climate reporting entity, they must produce their own climate statements. If only the subsidiary is a climate reporting entity, then they would just, in terms of the answer we had before, they'd talk about what was relevant from their parent that influenced their activities. But no, if each of the parent and the subsidiary is a climate reporting entity, they must produce their own climate statements. Now, obviously, a lot of the information might be very similar, but they would have to be prepared for each climate reporting entity. Is there anything you want to add on that one, Lisa?
No, so basically you would have to do the group and then you'd have to do the subsidiary. Yeah.
Okay. Given the need for comparability, why was the requirement to disclose emissions factor sources or global warming potential values removed? Would this not make global greenhouse gas emissions calculations more of a black box? It's a really good question. So we had lots of sessions with assurance practitioners, with users, about what was the information that they considered would be absolutely critical for their users to know. And the ones that we have now proposed are those ones. So emissions factor sources, global warming potentials, etc. Any information, so the information that we've got in the standards are the ones that we heard were the most relevant and the most influential for primary users' decision making. However, again, I would really encourage you, this is an exposure draft. If you think that some of that information is absolutely critical and primary users could not make a good decision without knowing that level of detail in terms of the mandatory disclosure requirements, please do tell us. And then, we can, the XRB board can make a decision about whether or not to put those in the mandatory disclosure requirements. But again, in terms of materiality, if you get if in the final standards those are not disclosure requirements, however, you get very strong feedback from your primary users that they want to know that level of detail, then that you would put that in. That would be additional information that under the principle of fair presentation you would have to include. Okay, these are brilliant questions. Thank you so much everyone for all your participation. In terms of the statement of compliance, oh sorry, I've missed one. Can you only state compliance if you've been audited, or can we still state that on our first year which isn't audited? Okay. Good question. All right, I'll hand that one over to you, Lisa.
Yes, you can state yes, you can state compliance in your first year. So basically, as long as you have complied with the requirements in the standard, you state compliance with Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Yeah. The assurance engagement is separate to that.
Yeah, so the assurance requirements are set in legislation. It's from 27 October 2024. So you would, if you are a climate reporting entity and you are preparing climate statements for that year before assurance is required, you must state compliance. And then, then you would state compliance going forward with the assurance requirements kicking in. In terms of the statement of compliance, if first-time adoption provisions are being applied, how should this be reflected in the wording?
Okay, so we are going to talk about NZ CS3 at our next deep dive, but very quickly, NZCS2 will require you to just note down those first-time adoption provisions that you have elected next to your statement of compliance. So if you look in NZCS2, there is a requirement that says that. So you'll have your statement of compliance, and then you'll say, we have elected to not provide comparatives, blah, blah, or, you know, something like that. So yes, there is a requirement to do that.
Okay. We've got lots of questions, and we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to do my best to get through some of these. Which metrics must be published with at least 2 years, with at least 2 comparative years?
So the requirement is for all metrics, but there are first-time adoption provisions. So the idea behind it is it's based on a TCFD recommendation, and is to allow users to see the trend. So obviously having the 2 years comparatives allows you to see the trend, whether it's up or down.
Is there an expectation that companies make their own statement of compliance, or that a third party provides assurance of the company's compliance?
No. No, the statement of compliance needs to be made by the entity preparing the disclosures.
And that is, I think that's one of the key, you know, if you are an entity with directors, the directors have responsibility in this area. So please do have a look at the legislation and make sure that your directors are very aware of their obligations. When does a reporting entity need to provide a table outlining the location of disclosures made?
Okay, so that table is if you decide to integrate your disclosures within your annual report, you would have to do it at the same time. Obviously, if you decide to do a standalone climate or group climate statement, the table is not needed, because obviously you have your information in one separate report.
If your entity does not have primary users as defined, and the example, it says e.g. mutual, so I'm not quite sure that, what that might be referring to, are you able to define who you believe is most interested in the information and report accordingly, or should you consider what an investor might require? So I'm not 100% sure about that question. The primary user is an existing and potential investor, lender, and other creditor. So every climate reporting entity that is captured in the regime is captured because it is an entity into which people can invest. So yes, you should be considering the needs of your investors, your existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors when you make your disclosures. Hopefully that answers that question. Oh, Lisa, this is definitely one for you, not for me. If there is a material event after the reporting period, do we follow what IAS 1 requires to be disclosed based on the time of the happened event?
Yep, so I did briefly mention there are some, I was going to try and give you a paragraph. Can I give you a paragraph? There are some requirements under the reporting period in NZCS3 that cover that. I think it is para 26. So yes, you would have to make a disclosure if it was between the period before they're authorised.
Okay, and Tim Grafton, thank you very much, has helpfully explained that the mutual is owned by its members and has no investors. However, in that case, the members would be the investors. So yes, it would be what the members would be. They would be your existing investors. So yes, I would absolutely be looking to understand what they would be wanting you to disclose. Thank you very much. Right, if you provide a link in your annual report, can you caveat with available from XX date, i.e. so you can produce your climate info later than your annual report?
No. No.
Yes, I would also think no. Yeah, no. So it has to be at the same time. You know, it has to be available at the same time as your annual report, because the key thing here is that you're providing information so that your primary users can make decisions about
with all the information available. The idea at the end of the day is integrated reporting. You need to have all this information to make these decisions. So, yeah.
Are there any instances where primary users of the same reporting entity may have different or conflicting considerations for materiality judgments? Really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say yes. add what to do about that, Amelia?
Yeah, so yes, and so there is a section in NZ CS3 where we talk about trade-offs, especially between the principles. And I think, you know, it really would apply for materiality as well. So if the key would be what, you know, you would not, if there are some of your primary users who would be looking for more detail, that is potentially where you could use that cross-referencing to really good effect. So if you are aware that some of your primary users are very, very keen for, you know, more detail, but actually you think the majority of your primary users do not need, you know, that much detail, you could look at using those cross-reference methods. But you know, as I said, we're very keen, you know, these disclosures are supposed to provide information that is useful for primary users to make decisions. And if you're not providing an adequate level of information for all of your primary users, then you would need to provide, you know, more information. But think about the location of disclosures and the presentation requirements in terms of how you do that.
I was going to say, I think in the accounting conceptual framework, there's, you know, you kind of have to look at your users and obviously your group of users. So you've got to look at, obviously, as a whole, what is that information? And there may be individuals within that group, but as you say, Amelia, you're trying to, I guess, satisfy the needs of the majority in some of those cases.
That's right. Okay, we'll finish on this last question, which is a brilliant question. Thank you so much for asking it. So, does the XRB need to disclose its climate-related disclosures? So no, the XRB is not a climate reporting entity. We do not need to disclose. However, the XRB is, you know, we are measuring our emissions. And, you know, obviously we have a lot of passionate people here at the XRB who are very much interested in this area. So we do not need to do it, but we are definitely, you know, we're starting on our own reporting journey. So we are very keen, you know, to go alongside all these entities who are having to do it as well. So sorry for those of you who I didn't get to your questions, not too many left. We will do our best to answer those in some separate way. So just to remind everyone, we do have 3 more deep dive events. So we've tried to target them to the type of climate reporting entity that you are, so that we will have very specific examples for you, so that, you know, most meaningful, and they are 2 hours long, so that we can cover all of the information and have a chance to get to your questions. Please just go to the events page on our website, that's xrb.govt.nz, and I will close by saying the consultation closes on the 26th of September, and we absolutely need submissions in by this date so we can issue the final standards in December 2022. So we've had very clear instruction from our board that, you know, if submissions come in after that date, we cannot you know, we cannot really look at those in detail, because we will be so busy looking at the ones that do come in by the 26th of September. So, but we are so keen to get your views. Thank you so much to everyone who's asked a question. Please contact us, climate@xrb.govt.nz if you have any other questions. And when you provide your feedback, do please provide it in a way that's most convenient. You can email us, you can do a submission online, you can provide us a letter, and all of the questions, we capture all the questions, and we think about all of those when we come to amending the disclosure requirements. So that is everything from the team. Really hope that that's been helpful for you. It's been recorded, so you can re-watch it. And is there anything else you want to close with, Lisa?
Do you want to do your last poll before you let them go?
Thank you so much. Good. Remember, I completely forgot. Poll 2, launch. Okay, here's hoping. So based on your knowledge to date, how well do you understand the proposed principles and requirements of draft NZ CS3? Oh dear. Okay, we've got a 1. That's all right.
No.
Okay. I'm going to close that poll with 100. So you can see most people in the 3s or 4s, which is brilliant. Really happy to see that. But yeah, as I said, please contact the team if you're not sure. Please read closely those sections, especially some of those tricky ones like materiality. And we are really, really pleased that you've come along today, and we will look forward to seeing you at one of the deep dives that we have next week or the week after. So thank you so much, and we will see you another time.